Thank you. All right. So, as usual, we have a lot of things to get through on the agenda. Let's start off with agenda item number 2, the consent agenda. Item 2.1, approval of the minutes for the May 30, 2019 minutes. So, are there any comments, notes, changes to the meeting minutes that anyone has? Okay, so with that, because this is a consent agenda, we will consider the minutes approved. Moving on to item number 3, reports. The first item is 3.1, Fiscal Operations Advisory Council, Chair Richard Bailey.
He is not, we will not have a report.
Yeah.
Okay.
No report, okay. Let me just say 5 minutes. The next item is 3.2, Finance, Facilities, and Audit Status Update, Fiscal Year 2019 and Quarter 1, Fiscal Year 2020 Report. Vice President Fox. And Stephanie. Good morning.
Good morning. Well, it has been a couple of quarters since we've had a dashboard update, since we don't meet over the summer. So today, if folks will turn to page 6 of their packets, we'll do a rundown of both quarter 1 2020 and then quarter 4 the fiscal year in 2019. On 2019, those are unaudited numbers. Our audit will be issued
Within days.
But until then, it will say unaudited on there. I'll walk through a couple of highlights on the capital construction, but at our January meeting, we will do a deep dive with Tom Kara, our head of facilities and capital planning. So we won't belabor those points because we have a relatively full agenda otherwise. So with that, on page 6, I'm going to kind of work around running clockwise, starting with the E&G fund balance. We can see the green line is the prior year, the blue line, kind of the partial line, is the current year. I want to point out that the first quarter, or the first month in July, is pretty low. And the reason for that is this was the start of the state's 2-year budget cycle. And oftentimes in the first quarterly distribution, which comes in mid-July, they are delayed for the quarter 1, they have like an 8-quarter budget cycle. Quarter 1, they are delayed because the budget is either just passed or in this instance hadn't been passed yet, so they actually delayed it until it had been passed and then fully authorized by DAF. So that came in mid-August, which is why you see it. Our fund balance increased pretty dramatically after that. Also impacting some of our days cash on hand, but that's the state funding is pretty solid this year, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but a little bit delayed. Other than that, the fund balance has come back up to where we'd expect, roughly in range for the year. Moving to the top center, the kind of donut graphs, we can see that our earn rate is coming in ahead of last year. We have 2 pieces on that as we talk about the quarter 1 numbers. Our tuition is coming in ahead of where we had anticipated. We have not updated our year-end forecasts to that. I want to see where our winter term registrations are so that we have a better sense of our full-year tuition levels. However, state funding is coming in strong, and then enrollment revenue is coming in strong. So we're seeing that on the earn side. As you'd anticipate, if we're earning in advance of where we were last year, oftentimes it means we're expending in advance of where we are. So that's a little bit ahead of where we were last year. Part of that is we've had payments for our rad science MIT equipment this year. So it's about $400,000 debt expense plus $100,000 in capital expense over the summer. So that pretty front loaded on some of those pieces, which is driving the expenses up early on.
But you think that's going to come back because it's like 20-some% higher than last year?
So it will. We will run in advance of this year. Will be more expensive than last year. Some of that is, in particular, we've got $2 million more worth of benefits payments. So I do expect, right now, we'll talk about this on the quarterly forecast. We're running ahead of where the board approved budget is on the expense side. We're working right now to pull that back in. And we've got there are a few variables out there. One is tuition revenue, which we think that's gonna be a positive impact. Our, what we call other pay, which really ends up being overload and adjunct pay, we expect will run pretty significantly in advance of budget. To be frank, on the provost side of the house, that's an area where they cut pretty significantly to manage within budget. I don't expect that they'll be able to realize the savings that they've anticipated. I think we'll have some offsetting on the tuition revenue side. Our S&S, we expect to be able to pull down to some extent through the year, and that's what we're working with our departments now. Basically saying, pump the brakes until we understand where our winter revenue is. And then from winter, last year we had a pretty big drop off in retention from fall to winter, which caused a miss on the revenue side last year. So I'm pretty cautious right now until we have a better indication of where our winter term revenue is. So we're working right now to pause on some of the expense side, see where our winter term revenue is, and then know whether we need to continue to choke down pretty hard or if we can start to release some of those funds. I'm gonna skip now to the, actually straight down in that column to the bottom on degree completions, and I just wanna kind of make a couple of notes here because this is and will impact our state funding. We can see growth again in our resident degree completions, however, it's lower than it was 2 years ago. So the 18-19 degree completions at 545 residents is lower than the 557 and 16-17, but it's up pretty significantly from 17-18. That big drop in 17-18 hurt us on the state funding side, but we're back on a growth trajectory, which is good. I wanna see another year of that, and then we'll start seeing the state funding formula will kind of be the wind will be at our back if we can continue to grow on the degree completion side. Moving over on the left-hand column, and I've skipped over some of the enrollment pieces. I wanna save that for last, and we can actually see some of the impact of investments that were made by the board last year in the enrollment side, so I wanna kind of save that for last. On the key financial indicators, it's right below the E&G fund balance line graph. A couple of pieces, one, the days cash on hand, that has come down from the prior year. However, it's still relatively strong at 97 days cash on hand. Some of that is a timing impact of capital expenditures. Some of that is at the end of September, is right at the beginning of the school year, and so we float financial aid payments for a few days. And so our cash balances oftentimes dip pretty dramatically right at the beginning of term. What happens is student signs up for a class, we pay financial aid, and then there's a 3 or 4 day wait until the federal government reimburses us for that expense. And so we end up having cash out the door before cash comes back in. And so that's a part of that dip in days cash on hand, though that has come back up pretty significantly over the last 2 months.
Up in here, that's significant with the financial aid piece because we started our semester at the very end of September. So that money flows out at the end of September, it comes back in August. So there's gonna be, you'll see that. What's that?
In October.
October, sorry. Yes, backwards. But that is significant at the end of a quarter when we have classes starting right then, because you won't see it till the next quarter.
So Brian, I have a question, looking at this as a dashboard,
Mhm.
days cash on hand, 97 days, you said that was lower than previous. What would be a yellow flag if this were to drop down even more? When would you start to have concern, or do you think that still 97 days is a pretty good position to be in?
So once, I'd like to see at least 2 months cash on hand. So if we're sitting at 60 days, that's kind of the place where I would start to be a little wary. Even below that is, many of the institutions in the state are below that. I don't really wanna be below that. Any less than that, then we probably need to start thinking about having external liquidity, so a line of credit so that we can manage capital payments, capital construction.
Yeah.
So below 60, I think there's a pause. This does not include the quasi endowment.
Right.
And we are able, the call provision on that, I believe, is 30 days. However, the treasury has indicated to us, which is $7.5 million, it's a pretty significant chunk of change for us. The treasury's indicated if we needed access to that, they could likely do that on 7 or less days. It's a highly liquid account, but technically the call provision is 30 days.
Okay, so bottom line is 97 days, this is still a pretty strong position to be in for cash on hand.
Yeah, it is.
Thank you.
Moving into the kind of the center two bar graphs, I wanna focus on the blue bar for fall term and the student credit hour enrollment. We see 3 years worth of growth there in student credit hours in the fall. That's a really good indicator, and that growth in student credit hours this year was about 1.5%. We built the budget around a 1% increase in student credit hours, so we're running ahead of what we had anticipated for the year, not by a significant amount, but by a decent amount. The composition of that and the like how we got there, it has some pretty significant changes. So we saw last winter, from fall to winter, we saw a reduction in our retention and our term-to-term retention in students. And you can actually see this really visibly in these two graphs. If you look at the fall term, at least on my printout it's green, I think that does correspond to the middle bar. You can see that the student credit hours are higher in fall term 2018-19 than they were in 17-18. But then if you look at winter term, the student credit hours for 18-19 and 17-18 are essentially identical. So that's the impact of a reduction in retention. And so we had a reduction in retention, but we had a very, very strong freshman class. And so the growth, the investments that the board made last year in enrollment management, which were really focused around first-time freshman growth, that has paid off and counteracted some of that decline in term-to-term retention. So that's a place where we're really focused right now, both operationally to ensure that that doesn't happen again, but on the finance side, we're pretty focused on our fall term, or our winter term registrations, and that's why we're kind of taking a pause on updating our tuition forecast. We want to make sure that we don't have the same issue we had last year.
So you were referencing the 2018-19 versus 17-18.
Exactly, yeah, the green bar and red bars.
It's turquoise.
Okay.
Is that right?
So when you say you're operationally focused to make sure that doesn't happen again, what does that mean?
One of the things we are doing is making some significant changes. We're advising on retention is going to be, we are going to move it. I've just announced we're going to move it to academic affairs. Because even though there was a lot of efforts going on outside of academic affairs and enrollment management, I repeatedly heard on the academic side, we don't know how to use that information, what that information is. So under Provost Mark, we are moving advising and retention to the academic side, so there is more engagement from the academic departments. These are students already here in classes, we just have to keep them. And we need to set some registration goals for the next term before students leave campus. And we tend to change them. I know the deans have put new processes in place, so there is a lot more academic side engagement. So that's our initial effort right now.
It's hard to tell, so how many people is that? I mean, it's,
Offhand, I do not know.
I don't have that.
is it
number.
people or is it just less classes?
So it's been, it's largely people,
Okay.
would be my guess, and some of it has been the institution, and again, these are gonna be kind of broad, but over the last decade, our enrollment pattern has actually changed dramatically in who we serve. So, it used to be primarily freshman traditional students. There's always been a non-traditional cohort at Oregon Tech. Freshmen actually declined pretty dramatically and were replaced with transfer students, which is a much more fickle market, right? It's much more sensitive to the economy and to the enrollment in community colleges. And what we started seeing, if you have a really strong economy, you're more likely to lose those kids. Now we're growing our freshmen back, which is a much more consistent marketplace. One is they tend to take full loads, right? So if the fixed cost of having any individual head, right, exists, but if they're taking very small credit loads, then you have a lot of fixed cost that you're having to manage too.
For example, this fall, we are 32 students less in college age students. but there are a lot more freshmen who are taking a full load. That is the reason we have more hours. And Grace and her team, in charge of dual credit, they did a great job of stabilizing that. Last fall, we had 100 fewer students or something in dual credit.
We're about 110 fewer
Yeah,
last
this
fall.
time, she and her team made sure we were about even, if not 10 students off beyond last. So our growth has happened in the right area in terms of college age students and freshmen who take a full load. And if we can do a better job of retaining those freshmen, that's really where we lose. We lose new students at Oregon Tech. If we can elevate that retention, and that is going to show a more robust enrollment and credit hour production, which translates to tuition revenue.
Thank you.
The last thing that I'll point out on the dashboard, and it sort of underscores the conversation that we've had, if we move to the right where it says undergraduate student pipeline, these are students roughly broken out by their grade standing. And what we can see here is the blue bar in fall 2019, freshmen, significant jump from the year prior, which was essentially flat to the year before that. So you get that growth there. That is the impact of the investment that was made by the board last year in enrollment management. And we expect that the full impact of that investment and ongoing work will play out next fall and then the fall after that. Enrollment really is a multi-year pipeline. Start influencing a student as a sophomore and junior in high school, they commit as a senior, so you've got a couple years worth of build before it really comes on strong. I suspect that we'll probably hear about enrollment management later this afternoon, but you can already see kind of early positive indicators there. Also important, if you move over to the sophomore year, you can see that this year our sophomore class is pretty small. And that, once again, is that impact of lower retention numbers in the prior year. So if we replace next year, if those freshmen become sophomore, if we can manage retention, then that puts us into a stronger place. We're gonna have a small class that works its way through, but if we can hold on to the ones that we have and keep the growth up, we'll be replacing small classes with larger ones.
That undergraduate student pipeline, that's it's a head count.
Yep.
How do you get such a big jump between junior and senior?
Yeah, so the senior, that's why I used the word roughly there. We've got the problem with we have two issues with seniors. Our average student is graduating with well north of 200 credits. Typically, you'd expect that number to be 180. 180 credits gets you through in 4 years on a quarter system, 120 equivalent on a semester system. Our students are graduating with, if they're freshmen, this data is a couple of years old last time I looked, but our average freshman graduated with 225 credits. Our average transfer graduated with 240 credits. So that's a 50 year right there.
Yeah, it's a 5 year. Got it.
The way you put them in these buckets based on those hours, and they bring transfer hours.
Yep.
For they could be called sophomore or junior, but they could be really freshmen because of the degree program they are on right now.
So it's like a combination of prereqs and, classes that they've maybe potentially taken somewhere else that are transferring over.
Correct.
Because of the makeup of those.
Or they are doing career transfer, career switches, they are going from education to health informatics or whatever.
Dual degree.
Well, our programs have pretty drawn out what I would call chain dependencies, right? If you miss one class, it's highly structured curriculum where take one, that's the stage gate to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So if you miss on one, now you're delayed pretty dramatically to hit 2, right? So you end up costing you another year. So some students will stay enrolled for the full time. That will cause some students to leave. So those sort of chain dependencies in the production process cause some of this backloading, or means credits that come in from other institutions where, I graduated with an econ degree, I could come in with a bunch of social science from a community college and probably would have been able to kind of shoehorn it in. Not necessarily true with mechanical engineering degree.
We also have the other interesting thing, I think, Ray's can attest to it, that you have kids that do a lot in high school as part of dual credit, but then we get only 8% of the population enrolling at Oregon Tech. So we don't quite see the benefit of that crowd at Oregon Tech, even though we teach a lot of dual credit students. They have really stepped up their efforts on conversion. in the past we haven't been as intentional about it.
About 5 years ago, the push for the state in dual credit was if it's offered, take it. So there's an entire group of high school students in the last 4 or 5 years that their high school teachers or high school administration said, you can get dual credit for your health class, you should do that. So now they have 3 credits of a health and PE class that isn't necessarily usable at a university. So there's a lot of credit accumulation that the dual credit realm is trying to rein in. Personally, I told my kid no. There's a lot of other students that just take whatever credit's offered, they take it.
It is important to note, all of the enrollment figures on this dashboard exclude our dual credit students. There's very marginal revenue impact to dual credit students, so I just pull them out. They're not good, it's not a good indicator for us to the financial condition of the institution, so better just to segment those on the side, though it is an important aspect of the institution. Moving to page 7 on the quarterly financial report, I will turn it over to Stephanie Pope to walk us through.
And with that segue, we did not pull the ACP students out of, there's nobody pulled out of the quarterly management report. But I will say we did exclude OMIC this year. In previous years, OMIC has always been included in these reports when it existed. They've started to get to a size now where it's going to affect the numbers a little bit more dramatically, so we have pulled them out. We do a report on them separately. But for the purposes of this meeting, the management report just includes our core operations in the general fund. So just as a high level note on that, if you look at the quarter 4, that still does include OMIC. The quarter 1 does not.
Stephanie, could you, when you said OMIC has gotten too big to include, could you kind of talk in terms of magnitudes, why you say that? Approximately, this is primarily capital, we do not have personnel
Correct.
in the general fund budget, even before.
So OMIC last year was $4.6 million worth of revenue. Which on a $70 million base or $65 million base is a pretty significant chunk. And what it does is that it flows through as other revenue, and then we end up with offsetting expenses either as transfer out or as supplies and services or capital budget that flows through. So we want to be able to isolate down just the kind of the core operating entity, and then look at OMIC separately, which is largely a pass-through function for us.
It makes us look as though we are getting all this giant revenue escalations, and if any OMIC budget is getting better every year. So we felt we need to kind of keep it separate. That way it also allows us to track it better for any future auditing purposes. They may initiate or state may initiate.
And typically the OMIC is a flow, like Brian said, it's a flow through, so the revenues that come in also go out as expenditures or show as expenditures. But there's sometimes timing issues at the end of a fiscal year, at the end of a quarter, so they're not gonna be cleanly in and out. So it inflates the numbers for the operations, and we wanted to make sure that that wasn't happening in the report that folks see. So with that said, I'll kind of go through this a little quickly, but feel free to let me know if you have any questions. You'll see between the first 2 columns, FY19 end of September, and then FY20 end of September, we're comparing the 2 first quarters. We have earned our revenue about $2 million more than the previous year. That's primarily due to the increase in the state allocations. During this last budget cycle, we made a push along with the other 7 universities to get an increase, and we were successful in doing that to some degree. So you'll see that reflected here in the state allocations. That first line, we brought in that money at a little bit faster rate than last year. Tuition is also up a little bit. That's a reflection of that increased student credit hours in the first quarter. But it's not the significant reason why we have that increase between the 2 fiscal years. There's also a little bit of an increase in the other revenue. Just as a reminder, this is grant, overhead, some sales and service revenue, those sorts of things. We see that increase in the other revenue primarily due to an increase in our grant dollars, and this is gonna be our overhead money associated with those grant dollars. So as we increase our external sources of revenue, we can increase our general fund revenue as well. So that accounts for the $2 million increase. As Brian noted on the forecast side, we haven't gone back and reforecast the numbers too cleanly yet. We're still waiting to see how our winter term enrollments look before we reforecast the tuition side of it. So what you will see is between the board adopted budget and the forecast, the state allocations go up. That's due to the state increasing their commitment to the PUSF. We've also drawn down the tuition from the 9% increase that we had approved at the board adopted budget down to a 6%. So you'll see that reflected in the year-end forecast. We're pretty confident about the state money. That's what they've told us they're gonna give us. We believe them. On the tuition and fees, we're again waiting until the winter term to reforecast that, so that we can make sure that we can be pretty tight on that number before giving it to you all. But that forecast is still under construction at this point. Any questions on the revenue before I go to the?
Is the formula for the state allocation changing?
So it is, in fact, tomorrow I'll be meeting with the 7 public universities as well as the coordinating commission where we're negotiating restructuring of the funding formula. There are 5 institutions that are plus or minus comfortable with the structure as it stands today, including Oregon Tech. There are 2 institutions that would like pretty significant changes in the funding formula, the University of Oregon and Southern Oregon. They both would envision different changes, in fact radically different changes. The HEC has made some contradictory statements, so that I think there is some sense that we probably ought not change things significantly. We're 5 years in, it's just fully implemented, probably ought to let it stew for a while and kind of see where we're at. But they have also opened the conversation to kind of put major components of it on the table. And the funding formula, kind of if one piece changes, other pieces may have to change as well. So it's, everything stacks kind of precariously, where if it stands as it is, it's relatively robust. But if you start to remove any component of it, then you probably have to look at all of the components of it. So I think that's the dance that we're in right now.
So the change, so you're looking at it now, but the actual, if there was gonna be any changes, that would happen, what, in 2 years, or is it year 6 or 7? I can't remember.
Yeah, so this is year 5 now.
Right.
It potentially could impact as soon as next year.
Okay.
Though if it were, the magnitude of impact would likely be not large, right? We would try and dampen any significant changes in at least the first year or 2 years to allow for adjustment. But it does pose risk as we look into next year's budget and beyond.
Exception would be anything that benefits U of O hurts Oregon Tech.
That's roughly right. We have essentially opposite program mix.
Right.
So we are negotiating from different positions. We have broadly aligned interest with Oregon State, which puts us in a stronger position. Yeah, it does. So, there are a couple of elephants fighting.
So Oregon is trying to change that program mix right now. They are beginning to introduce more hard sciences. They are looking at engineering. So, but that will take 3, 4, 5 years before they get to a level in which they can compete with Oregon State. So right now, they are really pushing back on the current funding formula. And we are sitting at a very, very optimal point on the curve. So any change is likely to be a negative impact on Oregon Tech. How much we don't know.
Which ironically means that the U of O's response is doing exactly what the formula was intended to do.
Right.
Right?
That's
Exactly. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is.
On the labor side, for this report, we see that we have an increase in our expenditures over last year at the first quarter, pretty much in all of the areas of our classifications of employment. The most significant thing to notice is that our OPE does have a large increase. This goes back to what Brian was alluding to earlier, that we have a significant increase in the first year of the biennium associated with our PERS and PEB costs. That will continue to happen, so we will see that as I believe it's a $2 million increase over the full fiscal year. So you'll see that reflected in the OPE areas. as well. So on the forecast side, we are pretty confident in this number, as confident as you can be when you're estimating. The way that we calculate our forecast is to look at what our current vacancies are, and what we anticipate our vacancies to be, and then doing some calculations associated with that, to assume where we're going to be at the end of the year with salary savings. We did budget a $2 million salary savings for this fiscal year. You'll see that in the board adopted budget. Right now, we are forecasting that we would be at about $1.3 or $1.4 million in salary savings. We have some mechanisms in place now to kind of track that, make sure that we can increase the amount of salary savings that we have through managing our vacancies in a wise manner, so that we can push that number up. The one thing to note in the forecast overall, in the adopted budget and the board adopted budget columns, there are some numbers below the line that are the strategic investment fund and the contingency fund. In the forecast, we push those up into the above the line areas where they do belong. Some of those are labor related, some of them are S&S capital, those kinds of things. So you'll see an increase from the board adopted budget to the forecast on unclassified staff or S&S or something like that, because we expend that money in those categories. So rather than having it be below the line, we've pushed it up so that it will show in our forecast where we expect it to actually be spent. So
On the, on the salary savings piece, right now, as Stephanie said, we're anticipating, this is one of those places where where the expenses have run, we're looking to pull those back in. And so we've instituted a new process where every hire or rehire decision is running through a committee chaired by the president. So that we're examining every position. It's something that we're working with our directors on, is because somebody leaves, does not mean that we automatically fill or refill that position. We're looking across the organizational chart, kind of creating, when folks leave, that's a tactical opportunity for us to reassign FTE or to limit the growth in FTE. And I think the value to that process, one, is it creates an opportunity to have a cross-divisional conversation to say, hey, does it make sense that we're investing here or here, and where do we need to start moving our manpower? The other thing that it does is it's a pretty strong signal to our department chairs, department directors, say, hey, we're not gonna automatically refill something. We need to really think about, can we bring in technology to reduce costs? Can we reimagine our processes that drive down the labor intensity? So that's causing some perturbations on campus. And we have been pretty used to, if there's a vacancy, you just fill it. And so that is gonna cause some frustrations from folks as we work through that process.
Also, the other impact we have seen, I don't think in that group we have met for 2-3 months, I don't remember right now.
about 2 months.
2 months. There has been no new position asks, other than places where people are redesigning their org structure to respond to associated savings. So it is more, what is not coming is just as important as, unless people feel legitimately something has to be replaced because they are talking to the paper first as to why that replacement is needed. And there are lots of places wherein we are saying, how can we double up duties if we have competencies, or how we can split duties, because our personnel structure is so expensive. At least in 1 or 2 cases, the benefits far exceed the compensation we pay the individual. There's one person I remember, I know it's 1 out of 500, but it is 160% benefits for that half-time person. That is just the way the compensation is person fed. So instead of 2 people hiring 2 half-time people, if they can hire 1 FTE and find the right talent to serve 2 areas, then we are saving significantly on the benefit side. That is the way Oregon benefits is structured. Trustee Starr's benefit, when somebody comes here, an employee, half-time or more, we first pay a $20,000 health bill, plus 35.6% on their compensation for all other benefits. So there is a step increase associated. They could think it's $25,000 half-time, why can't we hire? Well, that person immediately imposes a $20,000 cost to the payroll. Those are the things we are looking out for. And which, as Brian said, people are used to not having to look through those things. Now we are asking question, well, think about the organization. And I think, Tom, in your college, you have an example, you are looking at people potentially working in multiple areas, right? You have a secretarial support in the engineering and in faculty senate, things like that.
That's correct. Keep on step.
For the direct expenditures, area, we also see, an increase in our expenditures in that area. Overall, SNS and, debt service are the areas that I wanted to point out. Last year, FY19 was the first year that we started to do a new carry forward and carry rollover calculation. That was reflected last year, it continued into this year, and so we're seeing some of those expenditures from the carry forwards and the rollovers happen in this first quarter. Carry forwards are where somebody has asked for specific dollars that they needed. They maybe ordered something in the previous fiscal year, that thing didn't come in, so they didn't spend the money, they wanted the money to be allocated into FY20. Some of those expenditures are what we're seeing here.
But that is a sizable amount.
It is a sizable amount, yes, it was significant last year. We watched it more carefully this year at the end of FY19, but it does still persist. It is north of $1 million for the difference between FY19 and FY20 in both of those areas, rollover, carry forward and rollover. On the debt service side, one thing to note is that when we built the budget, we had our numbers for our debt service set from our previous year's debt service. We decided to purchase the equipment for Rad Sciences in May, which was after the budget was built, and so that piece of debt service was not built in here, so you will see an increase in the debt service between fiscal years and then also between the board adopted budget and the year-end forecast. That's due primarily to the Rad Science equipment and the debt service payback on that. It's a much quicker schedule than traditional debt service that we get through the state, which can be 20 or 30 years payback. This is a 5-year cycle, so.
And this is a great example of where about a little north of $500,000 was approved by the board. That sits in the strategic investment fund below the kind of net operations line. Is now moved up into debt service. So you see the delta in debt service, that's moving the strategic investment from kind of a centralized pool out into the proper expense category.
That's all the areas that I wanted to make sure I hit. Brian, were there any additional points you wanted to make?
Well, I think the couple points that I would make is for the first quarter of the year, our revenue is running strong. Both the tuition revenue is up $1.4 million, so about $300,000 of that is offset with remissions or scholarships, so it cost us to bring some of that in. State allocations also running strong. The expenses are largely running ratably, though we have anticipated increases both in the OPE side and then on the SNS side. Many of the things that were purchased in the last quarter or ordered in the last quarter of fiscal year 2019 have come in and are now expensed in the first quarter of fiscal year 2020. So that, to getting to Trustee Starr's question of do we expect that number to start to pull down, we do a lot of purchasing and a lot of work over the summer, and then now we're working on pulling pieces down. I think that's the question, is we've rolled over some budget authority from the prior year. We're gonna ask folks to give up some of the budget authority from the current year. If you have both of those go at the same time, which is when we talk about last year, that's where we ran into an issue at the end of the year, was providing some rollover expense authority from the prior year and expending a large amount of your current year.
Are you going to talk about some of the variabilities we have been communicating to faculty and staff on how things could change and how not attached to the forecasts?
So it is not included in here, but I'm happy to talk through it. So I do wanna say that the net change in fund balance right now, we are anticipating use of fund balance of just shy of $2.5 million. The board had approved $1.8 million. So we've got between this two about a $635,000 gap. Our focus now is closing that gap to ensure that we hit the board approved budget or better. So the points of variability, I discussed a little bit around tuition and remissions. right now, kind of our first run forecast, given prior year revenue earn rates, is that our tuition revenue would be $1.2 million above where we have in our current forecast. Again, that's built, I wanna make sure that I wanna see the winter numbers before we start building that into our budget, so I think it's important for us to be cautious now until we understand the winter numbers. And as I discussed a little bit ago, the kind of other pay, the overload and online compensation for our faculty, that's an area that in order for many of our academic units to meet the budget targets that were laid out last year, they cut those. The reality is they are not gonna be able to realize the savings. And so that number's gonna have to come up, which means we've gotta have the tuition revenue match it. Right, we've gotta have both of those come up in order to manage org.
Why aren't they realizing savings?
I turn that over maybe to Tom,
Well, I can add, really there are, in some cases, there are some unexpected resignations last minute. Just before the term started, Tom, you had what, 2 or 3 resignations in engineering? So all of a sudden they had to bring in adjuncts to cover those things. And this was the first time, 5 years ago, nobody had budget information or any numbers. Last 2-3 years, we are beginning to roll out and people are learning how to participate in the budget bill process. That's one thing I asked of the budget team. How are people participating in the reductions of targets? Because the $2 million is giant for us in our budget for the person pub increase, and colleges were very cooperative trying to accommodate those things. But they also gave in adjuncts and there were other adjustments that were not feasible at the end. So we are working through that variability right now, and the surprises they have, you don't immediately hire somebody in Klamath Falls. Adjuncts are hard to come by, then they are going to overload to faculty, which strains the faculty. So there are multiple factors playing into this. Also, I think Brian referred to the $600,000 variability. And I think because there is more transparency, we are sharing more information, people are too anxious. How are you going to solve the $600,000? Actually, Brian worked with the Fiscal Operations Advisory Council the other day. You two presented, we could end the year $1 million ahead if we can watch the retention. So that variability right now is hard to predict. But for folks that are exposed to these numbers for the first time, they are panicking with, oh my gosh, 600,000, it's lower. Well, we may not spend all of the strategic investments, and we are being careful how to manage that. For example, DPT is a good example. There are places where it is ahead, and we are not looking to carelessly spend that money elsewhere. So I think there are many places. I am confident we will be ahead of the board approved bottom line, but we also want to come out ahead in the operating side of the house. But that unknowns are uncomfortable for people.
I think something that Dr. Mata, our new provost, is highly focused on, what I would call kind of course planning and management, which has not been a strength, and I think that came through in the kind of faculty load internal audit that was done last year, that there was a lot of process gaps there. And it's something that she is very, very focused on, not something that she can turn on a dime. We've got a lot of distributed authority at the department chair level and not a lot of process and forecasting to manage, kind of to match the demand supply piece. And so it will be an extended process for her to be able to realize that. The realization of that is going to cause what I would call slightly perturbations amongst many of our faculty and departments as we go through that process.
Going back to Trustee Starr's comment, how are we going to award it? I think really I want to compliment the deans and the provost for really focusing on this right now. Trying to stay ahead, you cancel like 13 sections, 13 courses or something that were under populated. I don't know in which college, which department. So that is beginning to get into practice, so I want to compliment the provost and the deans for paying attention to those things. That way students can plan better. If 80+% of the students are registered for the next term, we can make sure those courses are staffed correctly rather than last minute reacting to 4 students wanting a class to graduate. So it's getting more proactive, but that's all new speak and new ways of doing things.
the shifting of enrollment to a larger focus on first-time freshmen allows for a better understanding of your cohorts and a more predictable course offering. By having students flow in and out of the institution, it makes it really hard to forecast and manage your demand. And so then you end up, if you're gonna offer classes to be supportive of those students, you end up running at really low utilization yields, right? And so that's that supply demand matching is gonna be the hard work for our academic units over the coming year and years.
Do they have targets for utilization?
I don't believe they do.
Say that again, please.
Are there targets for utilization,
Utilization of,
students per professor?
we do not have really any, our analytics has been poor, it has been more happenstance. Now all of a sudden, we are beginning to pay attention as we are developing institutional dashboards. What are some of the populations in the various classes? For example, a few weeks ago when I was tracking enrollment more closely every day, in 4 or 5 departments, 40 to 50% of the lecture sections are less than 10 people, which is great for the students, but I remember a non-traditional student right in Portland Metro asking me a year and a half ago, Dr. Nagy, I love my class, I have 3 students, but how do you afford it? She's a non-traditional student, she came from industry, so she was asking those questions. I think we are beginning to pay attention to those, but that was not the case before.
How much time do you need, Brian?
Yeah, we can move,
Sorry.
we can move really quickly. So on the year-end report, I'll just run through this,
Yeah, that's right.
I'll just
Before I-
run through this really
Get back
quickly.
to the next one.
The column to look at is the second column and it's the June actuals. And so that gives us fiscal year end to fiscal year end. This, to note, does include OMIC, and the place where you'll see that is on the other revenue. About $4.6 million of that $7 million in other revenue is related to OMIC. It also plays out largely in our service supply budget and then the extraordinary transfer out. The places to note here, we ended with, on the labor side, largely matching where we had anticipated in the board adopted and adjusted budget. So we were able to hit within $100,000 where we anticipated. There were overages around S&S. Some of that is the OMIC piece, but even when you deduct out the I think there's $2.5 million worth of S&S related to OMIC. Even with that, our S&S or our kind of direct expenses were over. A part of that was debt service, which ran a little bit ahead of where we had in the prior year. The prior year we had unexpended bond proceeds that we paid down a portion of our debt service with. On the S&S, really 2 things happened through the year. One was this was the first year that we allowed rollovers and carry forwards from the prior year. And so we had prior year expenses in fiscal year 19. The other piece is our procurements office, bless their heart, became a little bit more efficient and were able to get dollars out. So our S&S ran ahead of where folks were in both our academic and administrative departments. There's some pretty significant equipment spent. And so that drove the S&S budget higher than anticipated. The piece to note here is last year, as folks are aware, we ended the year with $1 million beyond where we had initially anticipated, really around the S&S components to it. Since we're focused on 2 places this year, one is to manage the carryover rollovers in a way that we don't want folks to have a use it or lose it mindset, but we also need them to be managing their department budgets to what do you actually need over time. So again, over the last couple of years, we're pushing down budget authority into the departments to a much greater extent. With that is gonna come both the reporting and responsibility to it, which is part of the culture change that we're managing right now. The other piece that happened, which is why midsummer, we knew that our expenses were running beyond. We believed that we had the revenue to match it. In our business office, we had not. Our summer revenue was split between the 2 fiscal years. It was our budget team's understanding that the split into the second year had been done. Our business office had not completed it yet, and it was poor communication between the 2 offices. something that I own at the end of the day. And so we thought we had the revenue to match it once we reclassified it, through our closing of the books process. It pulled some of that revenue out, pushes it into this year, which is helpful for this year. So that's a process change that we've made. Part of that is by having Stephanie, who now runs both the budget team and the business office, so that we have better communication between our accounting teams and our forward-looking budget and planning teams.
I should also add, part of it is, it's all new, below the budget office in the departments. The rollover is $600,000, which is really giving additional budget authority to the units, from unspent salaries and versus services and supplies last year. But in a department level, they think you gave us money, we are spending, what's the problem? But in our books, obviously it's added expense with no corresponding revenue. So if we hadn't given the savings from last year, we will not even have the $600,000 gap we are referring to right now. It will be under budget. So it's part of it is from a lay consumer point of view, how it looks versus how it looks in the books for some of us paying closer attention to it.
On page 10, and I would actually suggest that we talk about the ratio analysis at our next board meeting, when our auditors will be here to run through the fiscal year end.
Okay.
This is a new component to the dashboard. Really, it's a once a year snapshot at the financial condition of the institution. And so I think that's something that will be useful for us to take some time to discuss both how these ratios are structured, what to look at within them. And so there's some useful reading here. These kind of 4 measures are primary, the kind of industry standard that higher ed institutions look at. It comes from KPMG, put out and really has put out for 30 years. The kind of financial analysis bible for universities. And these ratios are kind of their core component to that.
Yeah, I felt like I was reviewing thermodynamics reading this.
You're welcome.
It would be helpful to me
Uh-huh.
if you actually did a line chart on this thing.
Okay.
And then maybe put bands of what is industry, where 1-to-1 is, but many institutions run above or below.
Yeah.
But then maybe back to Vince, where it's kind of a warning, this is kind of the range where we need to be worried about or not. And I think very quickly we could look at that and be able to just say, we're improving out of the danger zone, or we're approaching the danger of something.
Upper and lower control limits.
Back to thermodynamics.
Okay, Brian, so in the interest of time, and these next couple of pages are the summary status on the finance and facilities, the capital improvement program. We're gonna go through a more detailed report when we are in Cotton Falls at our next meeting. But this information is good for the committee members to look at and to see how we're doing. Essentially, we're doing really well on the capital program, and I can't wait to hear the report in January, because we've got some really exciting things that are happening on campus, in particular the CET building, but we'll talk about that next meeting. So with that, where does that bring us now, Brian? Are we?
We can close. I mean, there's information on on our quasi endowment and our cash balances. We have those invested with the state treasury, and I think the basic take on those are interest rates we're in a very low interest rate yield environment, and treasury is a very conservative investor, so they have a very short term duration and a high quality skew, which means our interest returns are pretty low, but we're hitting benchmarks with those. I think there's probably some utility over time to look at our investment strategy and see if we want with the quasi endowment to move into the equity market or have a more balanced approach, but that's a longer conversation.
Okay. Is that it?
That's it.
Great, thank you, Brian. Where's Stephanie? Oh, thank you, Stephanie. Wow, you're fast. Okay, moving on. Any other questions? Let's go on to item number 4 on the agenda. So we have 3 action items. The first one is 4.1, recommend the full board approve fiscal year 2021 budget development principles. Go ahead, Brian.
All right. Well, thank you. This will be this will seem like deja vu for many of the committee members, which we last year at I believe the January meeting approved these. These are a little bit different, the principles are a little bit different this year. What I'm happy with is that we're getting to a pretty consistent routine with the committee, so we'll review budget development principles, that helps guide the budget development process for the leadership of the institution, and as we devolve that process down to our departments, we wanna provide some clear guidance for them to help them make them, or allow them to make good decisions. So we are beginning our budget development process now. As I noted, I think it's pretty important and a change and a continuing evolution for us is to push the responsibility for the development of budgets down to the department directors and chairs, and then set divisional goals. So Division X, you need to hit Y, Division A, you need to hit B budget goal, and then allow the division directors, the functional vice presidents, provosts, and deans to manage the trade-offs within their division. So that way they're allowed to say, hey, this is the highest and best use. And so as long as we provide clear guidance on the principles, what you should be doing and how we should be orienting the institution, we wanna allow them that opportunity. And then bring it back for the senior staff to have an opportunity to weigh, alright, do those trade-offs make sense, or are there unintended consequences for other divisions? So that we're moving the whole institution forward at a good pace.
Brian, you'd be giving those goals prior to the budget development, or how does that work?
So, the first step of this is really say, here are the principles, the items, what we wanna do, right, kind of a high level rhetorical piece. And then set out, and this is why we will hold off to give those goals until January, because we wanna we wanna understand where we're at for the end of this fiscal year to help us build it into next year, and have a little bit better understanding of where enrollment is likely to be next year. Something we did last year, and I think this is still a conversation for us, what we did last year is we asked the departments to develop a 5% cut, a flat, and a 5%, is that right? And a 3% investment scenario. And so each of the departments came back and said, hey, we have a couple different scenarios. And then at the end of the year, when we had a better understanding of where state funding would be, that's where we laid out the divisional goals. That created some problems as we sort of force fit, hey, this is where we've gotta be into a couple of scenarios. And so this year it probably would be helpful for us to, on the front end of it, say, you need to be here, work internally, so you're not spending time on scenarios that you don't use.
Right, and that was just gonna kind of be my point, I mean, I think there's value in both sort of ways of doing things, but from a time perspective and just practical sort of getting through that budget process, it's kind of helpful to have enough guidance if possible.
I think that you just made Stephanie's day.
Well, then I'm just wondering, because this is the second run of this, right?
Mhm.
So is there, what can they learn from what we did the first time and say, this is what we tried?
Yep.
Or you tried, and this was the results? So that we just don't get caught in the do loop of,
So
don't spend this and then roll it over to next year.
yeah, so I think that on the administrative side of the house, both in the finance division, the president's division, student affairs division, they can develop and execute their budgets pretty effectively. I mean, I think we've got administrative leaders there that understand and have managed their budgets for some time, and so there I think that process is pretty smooth. On the academic side of the house, last year was a pretty painful process. It was the first time our chairs had any ownership whatsoever of their budgets. And now we're seeing where there were cuts made that weren't really cuts, right? And that's what we're dealing with this year, where, you know, the budget that was laid out is clearly not gonna be hit, particularly as it looks at adjunct and employee, just not gonna happen. So we're gonna have to deal with that in a different way. We also have a new provost, which means that there's gonna have to be a new process with the provost who comes in and has gotta develop her budget. So I think this year is not going to be as clean as a second year could be because of that change in leadership. Though she is working very, very hard right now to have a better understanding, I think that we will, I'd say it won't be as easy as learn all the lessons from last year because of that change in leadership, but I think we have pretty organized and focused person in Provost Mott who will get there and recognizes that that's one of her, major tasks as a vice president.
Okay, any questions? Anything else, Brian?
I just really quickly something that we are focused on is and have heard loud and clear and like I said are very focused on is to pull in our faculty through our normal shared governance process into the budget development. And because at the first stage of that is to use FOAC, the Fiscal and Operations Advisory Committee, kind of the body designated to do this, we develop the budget principles with them. And so the recommended principles that you see here were recommended by FOAC. Senior leadership team took a look at it and said, yep, that makes sense, and are moving it forward. So I think it's just important to note that from the outset of the budget development process, we are using our faculty governance process and shared governance process to be a part of that. The principles, I'll just be really quick on it. The first and foremost is we're gonna balance the budget this year. Right, we have clear direction from the board, and we're making clear direction to the institution that we will balance the budget this year. In doing so, number two is to prioritize recruiting, retaining, and graduating students. Students first, right, and these are in priority order. Number two is that we align programs.
Brian, I think we should clarify too, it's written here, we are talking about balancing the operating budget.
Yep.
So that the board still has decision room on what you wanna do with some of the strategic investments and so on. But it's the operating budget.
On number three, that we align programs and initiatives with industry and employer demand. So again, the industry focus of our institution is very important. Number four, that we invest in faculty, staff, and infrastructure to support student and institutional success. Really, number four is about where we make investments. They ought to be aligned with number two and number three. Aligned with students, aligned with industry demand. And then number five, which is really less of a principle, it's more of a how we do it. But we thought it was really important that we listed in here that we use an open and transparent budget process. And so that's what we're looking at, is how do we involve our faculty, involve the campus community. At the end of the day, and I think there's recognition from FOAC that the divisional vice presidents and the president need to make the decisions, and they own that decision responsibility, but that that there is value in talking through those decisions and getting feedback and input from across the institution.
Remind me again who's on FOAC.
So it is made up of the institutional vice presidents as well as I think 5 or 6 faculty members, and it's chaired by Richard Bailey, who's a senior professor in accounting. It's a good balance, I would say, of each of the kind of senior leaders for the institution are there to answer questions, but really is a faculty-driven committee.
How are the faculty chosen?
The faculty senate president and the provost work on the membership, and the president appoints the chair of the group.
Due to the labor change, is there any concern about this?
I think that we are seeing, I think the FOAC group, we are very careful to have, I think our, this middle of the road folks on that group. So that's been, I think, a really positive working environment in that group. There certainly is, poking and prodding and requests for information around the labor negotiations, which is a natural part of that. And because we're a public body, have limited ability to control the flow of information.
I am aware of institutions that have chosen not to have this process, post-bargaining. So there are institutional decisions. We are hoping we can have a middle of the road engaging of people, have the transparency, so that people know what is transpiring. But there are obviously information that we have that should be made available for business purpose only. And people that ask for the information may not quite understand that they are signing off a lot of legalities there in terms of how they would use that information.
On paper, the process, it sounds and feels directionally correct, to use a FOAC, and it feels like it supports the principles of transparency and shared governance. In practice, do they feel that way or not?
I think that
I don't wanna
they,
get too bogged down
Yeah,
in
no.
the noise that's going on right now, but how do the members feel about it?
so I've had that as a one-on-one conversation with both the chair and several of the other members. I think there's a, I'll say, often we hear, well, we want more detail. I've asked Stephanie, print out every transaction. So we had 65,000 transactions last year, it's 1,000 pages, right? It's like, well, here's all of it, I didn't actually print it out, I just have a PDF with it. Well, here's all of the detail. Is it really what you want? And the answer to that is no. Right, so where is it between the quarterly reports, which we provide them, right? Which I think is valuable to say the same information that goes to the board is the same information that you get. Well, that's probably too high level. So they wanna dig in, and I think that is the balance to strike is, where is that right balance between a very macro lens, how's the organization performing as a whole, and let's look at individual departments and areas, which is probably too specific to get down to, should facilities have bought a Toyota truck or a Ford truck this year? That's a decision our facilities director needs to make. But that is the balance. I think the place in those in the conversations that I've had, folks wanna understand not what the purchases are, but what are the factors that folks are taking into account when making decisions at a kind of larger divisional level. Brian, how are you balancing your budget? Right, and I can walk through that, right? Facilities took a huge hit this year so that IT didn't, because IT needs to make some investments that are forward facing to our students. The rest of my areas don't have a whole lot of room unless we're gonna significantly cut people, which is gonna endanger the control environment. Alright, there's a 3-sentence version of what we did, I can dive in on additional details, I think they wanna understand that.
Well, there would always be some folks who want to pour into more details, and to the extent possible, you provide that. But I think it is the variability in budget building and expensing over the years. Like, one of the things we have been saying is we don't know what the winter is gonna be like. For example, we were surprised by some new insurance premiums this year. There are all these new things that come on you, and it's very hard to nail down the budget, making sure there's absolutely no way we can be at a point we don't like to be. But that's what you forecast and you keep adjusting your processes, so. But it is all new, 5 years ago they had nothing. And all of a sudden information is flowing and different people react in different ways.
So Brian, let's quickly go through the development budget timeline, and then we'll get to your recommendation.
Okay, so in the timeline, this is page 34. Where we are today is really the budget development principles. So FOAC has worked through their process to develop these, and we're bringing them to the board now in mid-November. What we will move into is establishing some of those budget development goals. Question is, do we have multiple goals to have folks thinking about, are we making investments, are we making cuts, or do we lay out individual goals? So it's a useful conversation now. Starting in January, the budget office will distribute templates to the departments to start to build up their budgets, and be working with the division directors, vice presidents, and deans, so that kind of helping walk through what decisions they need to be making, so that by the time we get to mid-February, the departments have submitted their budgets to the provost, to their appropriate vice presidents. The vice presidents are then sitting down, however they determine necessary, with their direct reports to make budget shifts, and to set their goals. Budgets will be due to the budget office in early March, so that we can be prepared to come to the board in May with budget approval. Tuition setting process, which is important, that's part of this, is managing our revenue. Tuition setting process will kick off in January as soon as the winter term starts. We would like to have that complete by the March board meeting. That's a pretty aggressive timeline. Doesn't have to be done in March, but it would be nice to have that completed in March, because then we have some certainty around the revenue side of the equation.
Okay, is that it?
Yes, sir.
Alright, any other questions before I get to the recommendation?
I have a quick question on
Sure.
principle 3. If you're aligning programs and initiatives to industry and other employer demand, higher education, especially the 4 years, notoriously slow to respond to industry. So does that mean we're looking at pausing or slowing programs that maybe some of those classes that might have 4 students in there.
And I just wanted to make sure I understood it correctly. Are you saying, is there a process by which we hold back some programming? Is that what I'm?
Well, I don't wanna use the word retrenchment, cause everyone gets panicky with it, but is that where we're headed with these programs? If industry is not adopting their graduates in these programs and we're offering classes with 3 and 4 students, are we going to stop offering those programs that maybe don't
That's a
have
larger
robust enrollment?
decision on the academic side. If there are students in the pipeline, we have to take care of them, we cannot strand students. From my own experience, all those things are possible, you cannot turn it off and on in those cases, we need to be responsive. But it so happens, most of our core programming, we are so closer to the fundamentals, those things will continue to be useful. The risk is not doing things that the industry needs today, not being responsive, continuing to do what we have always done and done well, that's great. But whether it is cybersecurity, data science, and artificial intelligence, machine learning, we need to get going on those things, because that's where industry is headed, and we don't wanna try to play catch up really very hard.
I think there is an element though, as you add, you need to prune.
But what I think that if I heard the question right, are we going to suddenly stop doing those things? I don't think. Our time comes, we just have to see the students in the pipeline, make sure they don't get affected. But we have to be asking those questions, because AQSS or the chair of that committee had asked the same question, what is that we are going to walk away from if we are adding more things?
I just met with some representatives from the Cal State and UC system, and they have a process where they no longer allow certain new students into certain new programs. So if they're full in the psychology program, then fall 2020, they don't accept psychology students for next year. Or if it's under enrolled, they pause the enrollment, finish those students through, and revisit later.
Let me read the staff recommendation. This says, the staff recommends the committee recommend approval of the fiscal year 2021 budget development principles as proposed in the docket by the full board of trustees. So I need a motion.
Maybe I just forget what I'm supposed to do. I'll motion that. Is that correct?
Yes, that was perfect.
I'll second.
Okay, so we have a motion by trustee Starr, a second by trustee Stewart. All in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Okay, so that item is approved. Moving on, the next item is 4.2, approve the annual finance and facilities work plan.
And I can move very, very quickly through this.
Yeah, you have 1 minute.
Alright, maybe 2, I'll beg forgiveness. I think the purpose of this, set out a timeline over this year, and then we always have a prospective second year. This is work plan, it's really helpful for the finance division so that we can plan our resources and make sure that we're responsive to the committee. Something that we've also done now that I've been here for a couple of years and the board has been here for 4 or 5 years now. We've been able to get into a rhythm in our work process. The agenda is structured in 2 ways. Major topics are areas of significant importance or large actions that we're taking. Minor topics are informational generally or kind of functional activities that are reserved for the board. November, I don't think we need to belabor the agenda for today. Moving on to January, we'll have a presentation of our financial statements. We'll do a capital project status report, so we'll have a deep dive with our director of facilities. And if we can manage the timing, I'd love to do a tour while we're on campus, since we have a lot of projects either wrapping up or underway. We also will provide the first update on the tuition development process, which will have kicked off a couple weeks prior to that. We'll have a OMIC annual update from the executive director of OMIC and receive internal audit reports. I think there are a couple right now that are likely to be done by January. In April, our April 2nd meeting, if all goes according to plan, we'll have a tuition recommendation, receive internal audit reports, have our normal quarterly dashboard, and then have a wrap up of the legislative session. So there's a short legislative session that begins in February, ends at the end of February or beginning of March, so we'll have a wrap up to see if there are any changes. the piece that is of importance there is that they are discussing university capital. So we have a capital project, Boyden Hall, will be under consideration during that time, so we'll have understanding there. I don't expect any significant funding activities to take place during that legislative session. And then in May, we'll have a budget recommendation, that will be the major action for that meeting, the internal audit risk assessment and work plan. And then we'll do a normal dashboard, we'll have a prospective looking at the capital projects coming up over the summer, and then adopt the 2021 work plan, so we'll have the same conversation. For the next year, I'll refer folks to to the docket for this. And we have a prospective work plan for next year that allows us, assuming that stays roughly correct, for our finance team to be working towards these objectives, and then we'll revisit that in May.
Alright. Any questions? So let me get to the staff recommendation. This says staff recommends the committee adopt the fiscal year 2020 Finance and Facilities Committee work plan as described in the docket. Is there a motion?
Motion.
Great, so we have a motion by trustee Rust and a second by trustee Gomez. All in favor? Aye. Those opposed? That item is approved. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so moving on, the next item is 4.3, accept the internal audit follow-up report. Trevor Campbell and Kaylee Lyons. Oh,
They are on Skype.
Hello.
Hi,
hello, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, it's our
good
pleasure.
morning, can you hear us okay? And can you see us?
I can see one of you, but I can see Trevor, but I can't see Haley.
Oh,
There you
okay.
are.
I don't know where we are. We can't see ourselves any longer, so now we're not sure where we
Okay,
are.
yeah, Trevor is hogging the camera, so you have to move over, Trevor. Thank you.
Yeah, he's a little better looking than I am anyway, so that's probably okay.
Not true.
Thanks for having us. I'm Haley Lyons. I'm an audit partner here at Kernet Stokes and have been on your internal audit team since the beginning. Trevor is a senior manager in our audit department as well and has also been working with you guys for the last 4 years. So today we're just gonna go over what we've been up to, things that have come up, what the plan is for until January for the next meeting. So the agenda is on the next slide. And we will talk a little bit about, can I control the slides or are you guys, do I control them?
We've got
No.
it.
Okay, good. So we're gonna talk a little bit about the audit follow-up report that was included in your packets. If you have any questions on that, feel free to just holler and we're happy to answer anything. We're gonna go over the project completion reports that we've got, that we'll actually present on in more detail in January. And then give you an update on the projects that we're working on and an update of the fraud, waste, and abuse hotline. So the first thing in your packet is the audit follow-up report. So what we did is we went back to the 6 audits that we've completed so far and followed up on all of the issues that were noted within those audit reports. So those issues are, the number of issues are in that first column that's on this slide, audit issues for follow-up. And then you can see whether or not those issues have been implemented, if they're in process or they're not implemented. So we went back to the management team and visited with them about where they were on each of these items. In some cases, I think we sort of provided a friendly nudge that they have had that on their to-do list, and I think it's probably risen to the top in some cases. So as you can see, for telecom, there was no issues to follow up on, primarily because at that time, Jim Jones had just come in and basically refreshed that entire department.
Switched it to Skype.
Switched it to Skype, yeah. We then did the tuition remissions audit, and we had 2 issues that needed to be followed up on. Both of those issues have been implemented. So they're all good to go. The expense reimbursement audit had 2 issues, and both of those issues are in process by the VAO. And the in process component is that they have implemented the plan, they just haven't documented it or updated their policy for what they're doing exactly now. So, they are following the recommendations that we had, they just haven't, it hasn't made it quite into the written form yet. Accounts payable, 4 issues, 1 has been implemented, 2 are in process for similar reasons as expense reimbursement, and 1 is not yet implemented. But management did indicate that they are, gonna move towards implementation of that. The Student Health Center is the next one. There were 5 audit issues that needed follow-up. 3 have been implemented and 2 have not been implemented. We had a good conversation about those 2, and those appear to be, getting kicked off and they're starting to move on those. The last one is faculty workload. We identified 22 issues to follow up on. Management has not yet provided a formal response to these issues, and so at this point, they're not implemented because the plan hasn't been formulated yet. The new provost is aware of this workload audit and the findings there. And it's our understanding that, once they get settled, that this will become, a higher priority. Does anybody have any questions about the audit follow-up report?
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was just gonna say, this is something effectively, now that we've been, kind of in a cycle for 3 years, we would anticipate this will just be an annual, once a year annual report where, again, we'll look back, at audits. So next year, when we look back, the ones that are outstanding now, we'll provide an update on whether or not those have all been completed, and then new audits that we're doing this year, to the extent that we can look back on them. Sometimes there's a lag, there's certain things where it might take more than a year before it can effectively be implemented. So we just kind of, to start, we left a little bit of space so that there was, enough to kind of go back and revisit and have the period of time has been long enough to expect some, change or response. But this will just be an annual report we'd anticipate that we'll, give you every year to help close the loop on any open projects and items, so you know where the final status kind of rests on those.
So for the faculty workload item, and maybe this is a question for Dr. Nagy, it sounds like we have a new provost that just joined us. She will have an opportunity to focus on the 22 issues and be able to respond appropriately. Is that how that works?
Yes, she's just getting appointed and she is aware of this, as the auditor said. So she's working with the deans already on some of these, some of them might have been implemented in some form, but she will have an opportunity to review it more next term. There are other transitions happening, she is accepting more responsibilities in view of other departures in administration. We are double parking a lot of responsibilities on the senior executive level. One of the things I will mention later today is our enrollment management AVP is leaving at the end of this month. As a result, the entire enrollment management division is going to report into our provost on an interim basis. And advising and retention, as I mentioned, is going to move permanently. So we are really watching expenses at the presidential level, so we don't build on too many teams. She certainly will need help, we cannot keep double parking everything.
Yeah.
Because these are all important things to be done.
Okay, thank you. Please continue.
Great. So the next slide talks about the 2 reports that we have completed, and we do have an edit to this report, or to this slide. So the internal audit of OMIC, a week and a half ago when we put these slides together, we were, within minutes of finalizing it, and then as can happen, a question came up and that has opened a few other questions. And so management is refining some of their responses to our findings there. However, we will be able, there will be no problem to present this in January, but it does say this is completed and it's not quite there yet, but we're very close. We also did an audit of athletics, a fiscal review of the athletics department as part of the auxiliaries. If you remember or don't remember, we tend to look at an auxiliary every year. And so we did athletics, and We have completed that, issued that, and we'll present that to the board in January. The one thing I will note is that all of the items that we noted in our report have already been implemented, and management took those and ran with it, so that was great. Go to the next slide.
So that kind of closes, the audit projects that from last year that had carried over into this year, and now these next two slides are the projects that we're working on and that are planned for the current fiscal year. So the first one is the audit of the sponsored projects and grant administration office. We're in process with that. We've been kind of working, with that group, for the last couple of months, on a variety of things, that are kind of summarized there in the top, bullet. We've made some really good progress. There's been quite a few issues that, have kind of come out of that, and we're still kind of working to determine, what some of those might be for reporting back to you in terms of, what level of concern there might be or a potential response. But I think it's going really well. We're expecting to have that completed by the end of the year, and that we would be presenting it to you in by the time in January. Whether we're presenting the formal report, if it's fully issued at that time, I don't know. But we will be working closely at that stage to give you a better update at the end of January where things kind of stand in that regard. The next audit that we've just kind of recently kicked off is the academic agreements audit, which has been kind of rebranded to the educational partnerships and outreach. And so we have just started working with that department in the last couple of weeks, gathering some information for scoping and things like that so that we can be auditing that. We also expect that audit to be one that will be completed by the next time we speak in January. I doubt that a report will be formally issued at that point, but the audit work and findings should be fairly certain at that point in time. So those are the two projects that we have in process at the moment. If you go to the next slide. If you want to go to the next slide, and then for the rest of the year, the two projects that we have still on the docket, one is an audit of the Title IX. We understand that there's been sort of a structural leadership change or organizational change in the Title IX, so departments, so we're waiting for some of that to normalize before we jump in and start looking at anything. We anticipate starting that in winter, so sometime in the January to March range, we'll be beginning and working on that audit. And then each year, as you probably remember, we try to take a look at a smaller department of a smaller auxiliary of the university that might not rise to a high risk, but we think it's important to get kind of touches by internal audit on all departments. And so each year we've kind of looked at a different auxiliary. This year we're gonna be looking at housing and residence life. And that's one that we are kind of working on getting coordinated to begin in the spring. So that's kind of the status of where we're at on all of the current year projects. I think we're making good progress. I think the shift to kind of doing a longer term audit plan the beginning of this year, you recall we moved to kind of doing an annual risk assessment update, but scoping audit work for like a 3-year plan has worked so far in kind of freeing up more of the calendar to work on projects. So I think we're making some really good progress on the projects, and nothing's really behind schedule or anything at this point.
Yeah. Any questions on audit projects before we talk about the fraud, waste, and abuse ethics hotline? Hearing none, I'll just keep going. So there have been 6 cases open through the hotline since July 1st, 2019. One case was opened through the Oregon Secretary of State Audits Division, so that's a total of 7. the audits, the Secretary of State Audits Division was an interesting avenue for the complainant to take, but they did, and so the Audits Division reached out to us to find out if we were already aware of what they had noted in their complaint, and we hadn't been, and so the Audits Division turned it back over to us to resolve through our normal channels, which is great. That came in just a few weeks ago, and so that one is still open. We are definitely taking making sure that we get all of our I's dotted and T's crossed on that one, because we will need to respond back to the Oregon Secretary of State about the resolution to that matter. So we're playing a bigger role on that case than we normally would, just to make sure that it gets handled, with the utmost independence and all of those pieces. This slide indicates that 4 of the 7 cases were resolved and have been closed since, in the last week. The 5th one was resolved and closed. So the only one that we have open is related to the Oregon Secretary of State Audits Division. We have one that's in a monitoring status, and what that means is it's related to another investigation through another channel with the university. So we can't really close it until that's resolved. Once that's resolved, this will get resolved. They're connected in certain ways, and so we've just left that open, but put it in a monitoring category so that we continue to follow up on that and make sure that it gets appropriately resolved. Any questions?
Do we ever get any additional detail about the nature of the complaints that come in?
Yeah, in terms of you as on the committee, getting additional detail?
Yeah, just generally so we understand what's going on.
Yeah, so we put together a report I think we sent out in May, that showed a more detailed breakdown, which we intend to do annually. But just so you know, it just depends on the nature of them. In a lot of cases, they're fairly low level of egregiousness in terms of the allegation, which we view actually as a positive thing in that people are willing to use that hotline for things like that. We had one recently where it was a student matter. They didn't get as much financial aid as they expected. Another student also complained that the course material wasn't sufficient for their educational needs. And so those get directed back to the appropriate department to provide some feedback on, what they're doing, or the dean, in the case of the student complaining about their course content, reviewed the course content. In terms of financial matters, there are very few that come in with respect to that have any teeth, if you will. But it's all over the board.
And I would say that we can, I think what we determined, I believe, along with you in the past, is that for kind of these summary reports and for kind of the public, we're cautious about putting too many details, especially as it might relate to employment, employee matters or things like that that should be more internal. So we've just provided like a high level on here, but I think that additional detail can be provided at other times through whatever way that the board or committees would need.
We did notice, and the external auditors had suggested that more formal communication go out to the university about this hotline. And Brian sent that out, and I do think we saw a bit of an uptick at that point.
So Brian's, I believe Brian, speak up if I misstate, but is at least twice a year he's sending out a notification to the whole university. There's also been a little bit more integration into the training week at the beginning of the school year, and I would agree. I think we've seen good results. It's somewhat clockwork that after that email goes out within the next week or two, we get a few new hits on the hotline. But as Haley said, I think that we consider it, I think you should consider it a positive, because if people aren't using it for minor things, they aren't gonna use it for major things either. And so that recognition, we'd anticipate there would be, a little bit of noise, in there, if it's working as a real, resource and tool. So I think that's been a positive, we've seen positive results, from that in that regard.
So our university council has a comment?
If the board's interested, I could certainly work with Trevor and Haley to prepare an attorney-client briefing for you at one of the upcoming board meetings. So rather than an open session, it would be privileged, and we could talk about it in a little bit more detail if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, I think that would be good.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions?
All right, well, thank you again for the opportunity to present to you guys, and, please let us know if there's anything we can ever do to assist further. We enjoy working with you, and, always enjoy these opportunities to speak with the group.
Well, thank you for joining us. I mean, it's important, and I think the way that you've presented the information is very clear and direct and easy to understand, at least from my perspective, so we appreciate the work that you do. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks. Good luck with the rest of your meeting.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
All right, so let me, if this is an action item, let me read the recommendation. Oh, here it is. So the recommendation says, internal audit recommends that the audit committee of the Board of Trustees accept the attached audit follow-up report. Do you have a motion?
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion by trustee Stewart and a motion or a second by trustee Starr. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, so that item is approved. Thank you. Right, moving on, in the agenda, the next item is number 5, discussion items, and that's 5.1, internal audit structure. VP Fox?
Right. So folks will remember at our spring meeting last year, we extended our external audit contract for 3 years and extended our internal audit contract for 1 year. The original contract with Grant Stokes was a 3-year contract, which expired in June of 2019. And during that conversation, decided it would be a good idea to come back and really talk about what our internal audit looks like, how that function is structured, and think about what we want to do on a long-term basis. Keep it as it is, in-source it, do a hybrid model. And so this presentation it goes over how the other institutions in Oregon have looked at this, some idea of what pricing structures may look like, and pros and cons of different models. And this really, I think, is an opportunity, as much as I'll provide some information overview, it's a chance for the committee to say, what makes sense to you? And then that will allow Chair Jones to come back with staff and really work on a path forward, and then come back to the committee for a formal action later. So there's no staff recommendation to go one way or another here, but really an opportunity for the committee to weigh in. So the background is, as we spoke about previously, the university system had a pretty robust internal audit function, including a senior level chief audit executive. It also had a risk management unit that was in charge of enterprise risk management, and those are not synonymous functions, though one institution, Oregon State, has a unit that does compliance, risk management, and internal audit, which is kind of an interesting structure, but at a much larger scale institution. Upon the dissolution of the institutional boards, each of the universities in one way or another took on an internal audit function, which is just a good governance standard, but did so in different ways. Oregon Tech's Board of Trustees elected to go with an outsourced, I call it an external internal auditor, and issued an RFP, selected Kern & Stokes, which is an accounting firm, we just met with some of them, an accounting firm based out of Eugene, and the initial contract expired 3 years later. There are different configurations So when we came together last year, there were really three options for us. One was to insource it, one was to extend by a year or longer. The other was to use the University Shared Services Enterprise, USSE, which does some of our back office functions. They were offering a line of business with internal audit. Both Eastern Oregon and Western Oregon had used USSE. It was a pretty minimal service line. They had a retired accountant who would work less than half time for both of the institutions. So they could monitor the fraud, waste, and abuse line, but we're not really doing active internal audit engagements. Since then, USSE has discontinued that service, so no longer an option to go there. Western and Southern Oregon, Western subsequent to that, and Southern Oregon really from the inception in 2015, insourced. So they both have, Southern Oregon has one internal auditor, Western Oregon has one internal audit person plus a part-time position, which they're actually hiring for now. So it's kind of a 1 1/3 FTE. The third FTE is, or 1/3 FTE is split between procurement, the kind of normal business controller office functions, and then internal audit. It's kind of an interesting segregation of duties question there. PSU has a 2-person internal audit team. Their internal audit director, from what I could tell on his bio, had 15 or 20 years worth of experience, worked for Secretary of State's Audit Division, Portland Community College, and then moved over to PSU, and then has a second full-time accounting person or audit engagement person. U of O is the only institution that has some outsourced components. And so what they've done is stood up an internal audit team, has several, I think 3, maybe 4 members, plus they've outsourced IT engagements. So they have a hybrid structure where some components they didn't feel like they could either effectively utilize a full-time person, or it would be, they could extract as much or more value out of an outsourced firm. I don't know the scope of that full engagement, but I know that engagement exists, so that they're pulling in some specialized talent. OSU, the OUS's chief audit officer was located at OSU, and so that person was retained by Oregon State through the dissolution of the system, as well as much of her team. So that is a well-seasoned team at the university system level, and is now focused exclusively on Oregon State. And then they broadened that office, as I discussed earlier, to include risk management, and a full kind of enterprise risk management structure that they appear to be standing up in a more robust way. And then compliance function, which is particularly important given the level and scale of the research enterprise at Oregon State, including they have significant section of their research is classified Department of Energy and Department of Defense, so their compliance obligations are pretty significant.
Do you feel that EOU and Western would have stayed with USSE and they continued doing it, or were they? And what's Eastern going to do?
So yeah, Eastern right now is they're in the question mark phase.
Debate.
Yeah, exactly. I said that I would send this over as well as our contracts to their VPFA as they work through this. Western has been investing in their finance division pretty considerably and pulling out of USSE functions. So right now, our financial statements are completed by USSE. Western, over the last year, has really bulked up their controller's office to take on some of these functions. So I would anticipate that they probably would have, at some point, pulled out of that. Eastern probably would not have, and part of that is a finance component. Eastern is pretty strapped, and USSE, to be blunt, was cheap. It was minimal services, they checked a box, and they got the job done. I mean, the people there were confident in doing their job, but the scope of service was really limited.
I know we don't wanna go back to an OUS, but is there ever any conversation about just one institution centralizing this and doing it for everybody?
So
These types of services?
yeah, and this is, so the VPFAs for each of the institutions, we meet on a monthly basis and quarterly in person. And there is a subset of us who are kind of formulating what I would call USSE 2.0. We have USSE 1.0, we're like 1.5 right now, where originally it was spun out and just kept the lights on and the doors open for key functions, payroll being among the most important, but certainly financial statements, and they hosted our Banner, our ERP system. But it looked like the system. It has now to some extent migrated. We've pulled the Banner instance out of USSE, so that our ERP system out of USSE, and now that's managed both in the cloud with Elution and internally. And the other functions, I think we're at this kind of the conversation point of where does it make sense to drive down our cost in non-core functions. And I think the centrifuge effect of splitting up the system is still in play at some institutions. Just to like, all right, we're gonna do it all on our own. I think that's some of the bulking up you're seeing at Western. Some of that makes sense, right? The financial statement component, I think probably does make sense to insource at some point. But then there's also a question of what other topics could we centralize at one institution or another, create some spire of excellence there, and then outsource it. I think risk, emergency management is one of those areas, where a full-time emergency manager for an institution of our size does not make sense, but probably could work with Southern, Rogue, KCC, because there's a geographic component to it. The problem that we run into is assumption of liability. Right, how much professional liability is an institution willing to incur? The lawyers get in the way of it, but for good reason. No offense, David.
Didn't we try legal counsel that way with Southern couple of years ago and did not work?
Yeah, OUS, when OUS was in play, they had a general counsel that was stationed at Southern Oregon and acted for both of us, but we're the same legal entity at that point. So I think there's room. This is a function that could be, but do we have people to manage and run it? An ability to get the expertise.
So liability of that specific function or all functions?
I think internal audit is probably less significant, but payroll is one of those components where there's significant federal tax liability, where and this is something that Oregon State is kind of chafing at because USSE sits underneath Oregon State. So we're contracting with them for a professional service. And what if they don't perform effectively? Who retains the risk, the liability to that? Internal audit, less significant there. I mean, that's a smaller insurable risk.
Is the, I don't know the details of the PERS current situation. Is the future PERS liability sort of fixed for new employees? Or conversely, is it a disincentive to insource because that liability keeps growing?
So it's, is that like, so PERS is not just a past bad decisions liability that we work down over the next 20 years. The issue continues anytime you've got it's a defined benefit plan, right? So there's a lot of risk associated with that. Particularly the growth assumptions of PERS are pretty aggressive in probably a low growth environment for the next 20 or 30 years. So there's a continuing and growing risk. The other piece, and Dr. Nagy mentioned it earlier, is our healthcare expenses are very, very expensive. So outsourcing oftentimes, even with a profit premium on top of it, is...
All things being equal, we're disincented to hire more people.
That's right. Yep.
Well, and I think it's core competency too. That's the other thing that I need to think about is how much will we invest in training and systems and tools and as these functions versus if that's what you do for a business, you're gonna continue to invest in that, so.
Yeah, I think that is I concur with that completely. And that as we, I refer back to the docket on page 58, kind of laid out a best estimation of where costs are, and then what are kind of some relevant areas that we ought to think about.
If I may, Chair, I want to interject. That's actually a good point what Trustee Starr brought about. In this transition time, those are some of the questions we are asking. What should our organization look like? Are we just going to keep building everything? And for example, we tried the controller and that did not quite work out. Now we are trying with Stephanie serving budget and controller functions together in a new role as Assistant VP of Finance Operations. So what is the structure that will suit a university of our size and our scope? That goes to the question. Are we going to just build traditional organizations most universities have, or are we going to be different?
Does Curtis Stokes do any internal audit for any other universities?
We were their first client there. I think this is a book of business that they're trying to build. And my perspective there is that the first couple of years as they figured out universities, it was that they had a strong learning curve. Right now, I think they're performing pretty well.
I mean, they do other industries that would have some overlap, I get that.
Yeah.
There is something a little unique about the university space.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that them being able to bring in the external or other industry perspective, I think is useful. Higher ed, I think views itself as a snowflake. And the reality is there's core business functions to higher ed, just as there is running a hospital or running any other firm. And so bringing in some of that perspective, that I think there's utility to, including the risk return balancing, that I think is helpful to say, we're gonna accept some risk, because the cost to ameliorate it is so high that it doesn't make sense.
I think the comparison table was helpful. That's a good outline of pros and cons.
Anything else, Brian? That's your last slide?
It is, I think and I can walk through the comparison table.
No,
I just tried to put that table on, man.
That's fantastic.
Dr. Nagy, I didn't do well on this project.
No, that's fine. That's perfect. Thank you. Okay. So moving on. That was item 5.1. So now we're on agenda item 6, other business and new business. So is there any other business or any new business items to discuss? So again, thank you, Brian. I think it's important for this committee. There is a lot of good information, charts, reports that are included, particularly in when we talk about finance and facilities, the audit status update and the fiscal year quarter report that Brian gave. So I would just suggest, and I've talked to Brian about this, if any of the trustees have any questions about the report or the graphs that are produced, please do not hesitate to call Brian or call Stephanie. I meet with them, or I have a phone conversation with them once a month to go over these reports, and they've helped me tremendously. So if you have any follow-up questions, they're there for us. So thank you. Okay, so if there are no other items, no other business to discuss, the next item is number 7. We're done. This meeting is adjourned.
Yeah. There's 18 full days.
Sorry, 8 days.
They have come through, but it grew into because the teachers made adjustments and how they were. So if you exclude them, you will get the headcount drop, which is very common.